What's up, y'all? This is DJ Kenny Parker, DJ and producer for Boogie Down Productions / KRS-One, and today I'm back with another story. In today's story, I'm going to break down the fifth and final album from Boogie Down Productions called Sex and Violence. What I'm going to be talking about today is my recollection of the making of that album and the tracks that I worked on the album. Also, I'm going to get into the aftermath of the album and some little tidbits that you guys might not know. Okay, let's go. First, let's talk a little bit about the group Boogie Down Productions and what was going on with the crew around the time of the release of the Sex and Violence album, which was February of 1992. As some of you guys may know, leading up to the Sex and Violence album, Boogie Down Productions had been on a historic run. During this span between 1987 and 1990, Boogie Down Productions had released 4 consecutive albums in 4 years that all reached gold-selling status, which is 500,000 copies sold. In the history of music, not that many groups had ever done that. Boogie Down Productions released Criminal Minded, By All Means Necessary, Ghetto Music, The Blueprint of Hip Hop, and Edutainment. If you add the Self-Destruction Project and the classic Just Ice album, BDP was on a roll. In 1991, the group Boogie Down Productions finally took a break so KRS-One could focus on some personal projects. In 1991, KRS-One released his Human Education Against Lies project on Elektra Records. BDP also released the long-form video and live album Boogie Down Productions Live Hardcore Worldwide. Also, KRS-One worked with reggae artist Shabba Ranks on his Grammy Award-winning album. As for myself, like I mentioned before, I had started DJing for Boogie Down Productions at the beginning of 1990 during the Edutainment album. After a few months of DJing, I started to become curious on how hip-hop records were actually made, and I started studying the art of sampling. KRS-One, who's my brother for those that don't know, and who I call Chris, noticed my newfound enthusiasm for making beats and decided to give me the SP1200 drum machine that we used on the road during our live shows. Wow! At the time, this drum machine cost $2,000. In 1990, that was a lot of money. Even by today's standards, that's a lot of money for a drum machine. But at the time, the SP1200 was the premier drum machine used to make just about every hip-hop song of the era. Chris simply came by my house, dropped off the drum machine and the instruction manual, which I happen to still have, the old SP1200 instruction manual, and he said, "Here, get to work." By the fall of 1991, it was finally time for BDP to start work on a new album. As I mentioned in my past videos, around this time, BDP was having some beefs with some other rap groups. Some of the groups I've already mentioned, and there were actually a few other groups that we were having beef with at the time that I haven't mentioned. But we're gonna move on and talk about that another time. So when KRS-One decided to go into the studio to work on the new album, we had a couple of goals in mind. One, we wanted to revisit the BDP sound of previous years around the Criminal Minded era, so we decided to strip down the beats and make them as raw as possible. Two, we wanted to address some of the groups that had been taking shots at us over the past year that we hadn't released any new music. KRS-One decided to name the album Sex and Violence because at the time, he felt like that's all the mainstream audience seemed to be gravitating towards. So the album was going to be a theme album and a play on words about sex and violence. The first producer that was commissioned to work on the Sex and Violence album was a guy named Pal Joey. You guys may recognize Pal Joey from the Love's Gonna Get You video where he played the drug dealer Rob. Pal Joey was also the producer of Love's Gonna Get You, one of the biggest songs in Boogie Down Productions history. So of course, Pal Joey would be first up to work on the new Sex and Violence album. What some people may not know about Pal Joey was that he was also an accomplished dance music producer, and he produced one of the most classic dance records of the era called Hot Music. Believe it or not, when that song blew up in the clubs, Pal Joey actually brought the original disc to the studio and KRS-One recorded a song to that beat. Of course, it never came out, but somewhere on some 2-inch tape, that song exists. Also, Pal Joey produced a song called Black Cop for the Sex and Violence album that eventually didn't make the album. The song Black Cop that my fellow BDP fans know today is actually a remix of the original that KRS-One and I did later on. Pal Joey did 4 songs on the Sex and Violence album: Duck Down, Questions and Answers, Who Are the Pimps, and the controversial 13 and Good. I'll get into that song in a minute. Also commissioned to work on the Sex and Violence was the legendary producer Prince Paul of De La Soul fame. Prince Paul did 3 songs on the Sex and Violence album. I wasn't in the studio when Prince Paul recorded his songs, but I do remember hearing some small controversy because Prince Paul didn't get to mix his songs. He just produced them and they were mixed by someone else after the fact. I don't know whatever happened with that controversy, but I do remember hearing about it in the wind at some point. Our super talented engineer worked on a couple of songs on the Sex and Violence album, including a song called Rough Rough. Shout out to D Square. Now, somewhere in the midst of all of these other guys recording, KRS-One calls me up. And he basically said, "So, you've had the SV1200 for about 6-7 months now. What do you got?" Now, the pressure was on for me. I had been doing some production, but mostly pre-production stuff. Now we have not only the iconic rapper KRS-One asking me what kind of beats do I have, but also my older brother asking me what kind of beats do I have. Amazingly, I had a couple of loops that Chris actually liked. He said to me, "Take these 2 samples you have here, combine them together, put some drums under them," and left me in the studio by myself, and he went to the store to get something to eat. So there I was in the studio, just me and D Square, and I put together my first beat, which eventually became the song We In There. A few days later, he called me back. "What else do you got?" I played him some more stuff. He picked something that he liked. He said, "Bring this to the studio." When I got to the studio, Chris was there with another guy who I had just met a few months earlier at the Heel video. His name was Freddie Fox. Chris said, "Me and Freddie Fox are about to jump on this beat right here." Dope. We decided to make the song very raw and record it live right there in the studio, not in the vocal booth, but right in the room with everybody standing around. The song was called The Original Way. And what you hear is actually just KRS and Freddie Fox freestyling and fooling around in the studio. We recorded everything. Kenny Parker, you know you're rough, neck. A 1-2, yeah, 1-2 hop, and you don't stop. Chris called me back. "What else do you got?" I came to the studio with more music. This time, the beat that he picked became the song called Poisonous Products. If I recall, Chris had that whole song recorded to another beat, but he switched and put it on this beat that I brought to the studio. Dope. Now I got 3 beats recorded for the Sex and Violence album. Fast forward to about a month later, me and Chris were chilling and we were headed to the studio to work on something else. Maybe he was mixing a song that somebody else had did and I was just tagging along. In the trunk of Chris's car, he had a whole big stack of records that he had bought from a thrift store that had been sitting in the trunk for months. So I decided, well, since he's working on something else, I'm gonna take these records out the trunk and go through them. I sat in the studio for about 2 hours just listening to records, and I finally heard this one song with a funky beat. I said, yo, Chris, stop what you're doing and listen to this. We put it up loud in the speakers in the studio. As soon as Chris heard that groove, he was like, let's record this right now. I got some rhymes for this. I hooked up the beat in about a half an hour. KRS went in the studio and blazed the record in like one take. That whole song took maybe an hour to record and like an hour and a half to mix. In like 2 hours, we had knocked that whole song out, spur in a moment. The song was called Like a Throttle. Boom, now I got 4 tracks for the new album. A little while after that, we were in the studio and I decided to press my luck and play some more beats for Chris. I'm on a roll. Fortunately, I had another beat that he liked. And he was looking for a track to address the group X-Clan for the diss that they had said on their album the year before. The song that we recorded that night ended up being called Build and Destroy. When y'all guys get a chance, check it out.
Now what's this all about? Christian humanity. In my face, you're happy on vinyl, you're mad at me. Yo.
At this point, the album was just about done. All we had to do was go do some final mixes and do a little bit of cleaning up on the songs that we had. There was this one song that Chris had that was produced by pal Joey that wasn't finished, called 13 and Good. I actually came to the studio that day just tagging along. As Chris was mixing the song, he decided that the song wasn't beefy enough and needed some more drums. He turned to me and said, hey, Kenny, you got any drums in your bag? Of course I did. So I ended up finishing up pal Joey's work by adding some drums to the music. So now this is 6 songs that I ended up working on the Sex and Violence album. Also on Sex and Violence, I reluctantly ended up doing vocals on a few songs. At the time, I really wasn't comfortable speaking on records at all, but Chris kind of strong-armed me into getting on a bunch of songs. I have vocals on We In There. I have vocals in the chorus of 13 and Good. I spoke on the Poisonous Products. I spoke on Build and Destroy. I got vocals all over that album, amazingly. After the album was recorded and mixed, it was time to turn it into Jive Records and see what they thought. As it turned out, Jive loved the album. People from the record company were coming up to me saying, Kenny, you did a great job. We love the album. Fantastic. Blah, blah, blah. They were giving me so much compliments. BDP management. Great job, Kenny. Great job. Everybody was patting me on the back. I was feeling very good about myself. Now, one day I was walking with Chris down the street. We had just left his house and we were on our way somewhere. And I asked him, so what were going to be the singles off of the Sex and Violence album. Chris said the singles are going to be Duck Down, 13 and Good. Now, I really like Duck Down, so I was like, yeah, that's dope. But I really didn't care for 13 and Good. The reason I didn't care for 13 and Good was because I felt the music was too mellow. Around this time, this is the beginning of 1992, I was the type of person that hung out in the clubs a lot, and you can feel the wave of a new sound coming. A lot of aggressive songs with heavy bass lines and big choruses were coming down the pike. You had Scenario, Here We Go Yo, Here We Go Yo. You had Naughty by Nature, Hip Hop Hooray, Ho. You had leaders of the new school, PTA. You had Brand Nubians, One for All, Brand Nubians. You had all of these songs on the East Coast with big choruses and aggressiveness. I felt like 13 and Good was just too mellow. I also felt that 13 and Good was one of those songs that you listen to one time. It was a story with a twisted tale and a surprise ending. You hear it, and that's it. It wasn't the type of song that played over and over and over, in my opinion. Since I had reservations about the song, I felt like I wanted to say something to Chris about it. But that conversation was tough because, A, this is KRS-One. By that time, he was already a hip-hop icon. He had made a bunch of decisions and they all turned out right. Who am I to say anything? I'm nobody. And 2, this was my older brother I'm talking to, so it was more like I'm challenging him. At the same time, I decided to say my piece. We have that kind of relationship. So I said to Chris, I don't think Sex and Violence would make a good single. He turned to me and said, well, it doesn't really matter because Jive picked the singles and these are the 2 records that they like. Now, here's what most people out there don't know about the music business. It is very rare that the artists get to pick their own singles. Most of the time, the artists turn in their music, the record company sits down, they have a whole meeting with the promotion staff, marketing, A&R, the president, the vice president, whoever. And they all take the album, listen to it, take it home, live with it, and they all come back and make a decision on what they feel would be the best singles to sell the album. For those of you guys out there who are like me, who watch a lot of rap interviews, you ever notice how the artist is always talking about how they had to fight the record company and argue with the record company, and they wanted to come out with this, but the record company wanted to come out with this, and they had to fight them for the single, fight to get a second single or third single, fight to get a remix. It's always the artist who's looking at music from an artistic point of view and the record company who's looking at music from a business point of view that have conflict. From my understanding, for the most part, in KRS-One's career, he makes the music and Jive picks the singles and videos they want to put out. Now keep in mind, Jive Records was also on a roll at this point. They had put out Jazzy Jeff and the Fresh Prince, A Tribe Called Quest, Boogie Down Productions, Too Short, Spice One, Houdini. They couldn't miss. And all the singles that they had picked for KRS-One and Boogie Down Productions had all been successful. You kind of had to let them do what they do. Jive Records was so confident about the record 13 and Good that we shot both videos, Duck Down and 13 and Good, on the same weekend. And the budget was divvied up between 13 and Good, if I believe, getting about 70% of the budget and Duck Down getting about 30% of the budget. The video was shot by none other than the legendary directors, the Hughes brothers. You guys may know them from the movies Dead Presidents and Menace to Society, among others, but this was way before that. They were pretty much brand new. Recently, I would say in the past couple of years, with the invention of social media, I've been seeing a lot of people with comments on the song 13 and Good and the subject matter. Now, let me speak for myself. At the time, 1992, I didn't hear any controversy about that song. By today's standards, an artist would get canceled for putting out a song called 13 and Good and all the controversial things that KRS-One said in the song. At the time, we just looked at it like it's just a song and a story with a twisted ending. People didn't even look at it that deep. As a matter of fact, I feel the reason that Jive picked 13 and Good as a single was that they felt that this track and the mood of the song would get a lot of radio play, especially coming off of Boogie Down Productions' last big hit, which was Love's Gonna Get You, produced by the same producer, Pal Joey, who produced 13 and Good, and it was also a story with a little twisted ending. I guess Jive felt like they was gonna go to the well one more time with 13 and Good. Right around the time of the release of the first single off the Sex and Violence album, Duck Down, was released, the PM Dawn incident happened. For those of you that don't know what happened with PM Dawn and KRS-One, go back and check my old videos. I have a whole breakdown of the situation. Like I mentioned in the previous video, Boogie Down Productions received a tremendous amount of backlash worldwide from the media after the PM Dawn incident. About a month after the Sex and Violence album was released, the sales figures started to come in, and they were lackluster. Everyone at Jive Records began to panic. I do believe that the PM Dawn incident had a tremendous negative effect on the record sales of Sex and Violence. But that wasn't the only reason that I feel that Sex and Violence started out with lackluster sales. Like I said earlier, I do believe that the singles that were picked also had an effect on the record sales. Although I liked the song Duck Down and I agreed that it made a good first single, it actually did okay on the charts. For the rap audience, it did okay, but it didn't break through to the next level. So basically, the fate of the Sex and Violence album hung on the results of the 13 and Good song. Frankly, in my opinion, 13 and Good just didn't perform. For those of you that study music, history shows that in order for an album to be successful, 99.9% of the time, a strong single is required. Boogie Down Productions usually came out the gate with a super strong single, like My Philosophy, You Must Learn, Love's Gonna Get You. The song 13 and Good, in my opinion, just wasn't strong enough compared to the other BDP singles of the past and the songs that were coming out in 1992. Also, the subject matter may have made a difference, although, like I said, at the time, I didn't hear any of that chatter. So the question really is, and I pose this to you guys out there, those of you that know the Sex and Violence album and the history of BDP and the history of hip hop, what should have been the singles off of the Sex and Violence album? Also, to add to the controversy, was the album cover. I heard from Chris that due to the controversial album cover that he selected, many record stores and retail chains did not want to carry the Boogie Down Productions Sex and Violence album. Because of this, Jive Records had to go back and make an alternative album cover to satisfy some of the retail chains and distributors, which caused more problems with record sales. So basically, if you factor in the PM Dawn incident, The lack of performance by the singles, the controversy with the album cover, and the fact that BDP had been around for 6 years dropping music non-stop. And it was a difficult time for the Sex and Violence album. So 13 and Good was released as the second single off the Sex and Violence album. Once again, I was able to do some additional work on the song, doing a remix for the 12-inch. After the single 13 and Good was released and fizzled out, Jive was basically done with the album. They were ready to move on. This was only a few months after the album was released. We felt that the album deserved at least a third single, and we went into Jive and had a meeting, and they reluctantly agreed to give us a third single. By this point, everybody at Jive was in panic mode and began pointing fingers. They eventually came to the conclusion that the reason why the Sex and Violence album only sold about half of what the other Boogie Down Productions albums sold was because of the production. So of course, who took the heat for the music? Pal Joey and Kenny Parker. I started hearing grumbling from people at the record company saying that I should have never been allowed to produce any music on the Sex and Violence album. And it was basically my fault that the album failed. Now, of course, I felt some kind of way about this criticism. Jive picked the singles. They didn't pick any of the songs that I produced as singles. And then when the album didn't work, they decided to blame me. Everybody was saying, "Good job, Kenny. Great job, Kenny. You did an amazing job." But then when the album didn't sell, everybody ran for the hills and pointed the finger at me. I was young and I didn't understand the mentality of the music business. Oddly enough, it wasn't just the record company and management that was saying they liked the album. The critics in the magazines also were saying Boogie Down Productions made a solid album, and some of them were saying it was a classic album. As a matter of fact, the most coveted review at that time was from the new magazine called The Source. If you look right here, The Source magazine gave Boogie Down Productions' Sex and Violence album 4.5 mics. In retrospect, I'm not saying that the Sex and Violence album was a 4.5 mic album, but what I am saying was, at that time, people thought it was a solid album until it wasn't. Anyway, Jive Records agreed to give BDP the third single. Now, based on the shows that we had done and the response that we were getting, the most popular song on the album was "We In There," a song that I produced. So Jive agreed to give BDP a third single, but they were like, definitely not Kenny Parker beat. We're gonna get my man Ali Shaheed Muhammad from A Tribe Called Quest to do the remix. They also agreed to shoot the video and make 2 versions. One version with the original beat, and one version, the main version, was gonna be the Ali Shaheed Tribe Called Quest remix. KRS-One and I recorded a brand new song for the B-side of the 12-inch called Feel the Vibe, Feel the Beat. One of my favorite songs that I ever produced for KRS-One. Like I said before in my previous video about the Notorious B.I.G., I snuck and did a remix for We In There and just added some more drums to beef up the record without the permission of Jive Records because they didn't even want me in the studio anymore. After the We In There single ran its course, the album was over. The Sex and Violence album became the first Boogie Down Productions album not to go gold. The lead producer, Pal Joey, never recorded with KRS-One again. My fate was sort of still up in limbo. Coincidentally, right around this time, I ran into my good friend, DJ Premier. I jumped into the car with DJ Premier, who at the time was driving an MPV van with the most ridiculous sound system I had ever heard in my life up until this point. Me and Premier started talking about music, as we usually did at that time, and he was telling me how much he enjoyed my production on the Sex and Violence album. Me and Premier rode around the city for about an hour listening to the Sex and Violence album, and he was pointing out things to me that he actually liked about the album, which made me feel real good coming from a guy like him who was the producer of Gang Starr at the time. Then Premier said to me, "Let me play you something that I've been working on. It's called Dwick." Premier popped in the rough cassette of this song and asked me what did I think. What? His song was ridiculous, is what I told him. After that, we left. I started thinking to myself, this guy DJ Premier has a sound that would be incredible mixed with KRS-One. So I went to my brother and I said, yo, I was chilling with this guy DJ Premier. He's banging. You should work with him. At the time, Chris just said, oh, okay, cool, sounds cool. He didn't really say much. A few days after that, I was up at Jive Records talking to one of the new A&R guys, and I also mentioned to him that, yo, this guy DJ Premier from Gang Starr is incredible. Y'all should work with him on a project. And he was like, yeah, Preem is dope. Fast forward a few months later, we had a show, and during sound check, Chris comes over to me and says, I need to talk to you. In the conversation, he told me two things. One, he said, you will not be working on the new Boogie Down Productions album. BDP is going in a whole other direction, which was a devastating blow to me. He also said, we hired this guy, DJ Premier, to do 5 songs for the new Boogie Down Productions album. And I'm like, what? The same Premier that I've been screaming to everybody they should work with? Chris was telling this to me like it was a brand new idea, like I didn't know DJ Premier. Anyway, me being a team player, I was like, look, BDP needs a hit. And if this guy, DJ Premier, is the guy I think he is, I think him and Chris are gonna work very well together. So for that, I was happy. But at the same time, I also got, you're finished, basically. After the disappointing sales of Sex and Violence, history shows that 99% of most acts, especially hip-hop acts, would have been over at that point. In my opinion, any success that KRS-One had after the Sex and Violence album would have to be attributed to his incredible resilience and his amazing talent. KRS-One and DJ Premier collaborated along with some other producers to make the classic album, The Return of the Boom Bap. As you know, by the time the album was released, the name of the group was changed from Boogie Down Productions to KRS-One. And the rest is history. Eventually, as you guys probably know, I was able to work with KRS-One again on future projects, despite Jive Records despising every track that I have ever done on the label. I'll get into that later. So, there you have it, my Boogie Down Productions Sex and Violence breakdown. If you guys like the story, please give me a thumbs up and subscribe. And if you haven't already picked up the book, my brother's name is Kenny, The Greatest True Hip Hop Story Ever Told, please pick this up. It's chock full of information everything you need to know about the origin of BDP and a lot of stories behind the scenes look. And I'll catch you guys next time.